and welcome everybody to today's session, Know Your Rights, an overview of Title I of the ADA. And as Aaron mentioned, my name, and there's me, you see me on camera, perhaps. I'm Jeffrey Tamburo. I'm a training and content development specialist at the Yang Institute at Cornell. I like to, well, I have to, and I like to start out these trainings with just kind of what we might call a disclaimer. It's also a recognition of our funding partner. And just to remind everyone that comes to this session that any information I share or materials that we share, you should all have access to this PowerPoint that I know Aaron has and can either email to you, or it may also be available to you right now in Zoom. But any information or materials or technical assistance that we give, answers to questions, are intended solely as informal guidance and are neither a determination of your legal rights or responsibilities under the ADA. Basically, this means that I'm not a lawyer. I'm an educator, I'm a trainer, and I'm here to tell you what the ADA says, to respond to any questions you may have about the ADA, but this isn't meant to be legal advice in any way. We come to you, the Northeast ADA Center is authorized by our funding partner, NIDLR, which is the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. And it's located within the Administration for Community Living, Department of Health and Human Services, etc. So we're really appreciative to our funding partners for all that they do, and we're glad to have you here. So I am employed by the, and thank you, Aaron. I see you put the PowerPoint in the chat. I'm employed by the, as Aaron mentioned, the Lisa Yang and Hock E Institute on Employment and Disability. We're housed at Cornell University. Cornell University is home to the Northeast ADA Center, and we are one of 10 federally funded ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act centers across the country. We're Federal Region 2, which includes New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And on this screen, this slide lets you know that at any point in time, if you have questions about the ADA, there is a 1-800 number that people can call from anywhere in the country, 1-800-949-4232. And our email is listed here as well, northeastada.org, and our web address, northeastada@cornell.edu. And I'm sorry, I reversed those, our web address and our email. And this is just to let you know that if you have questions after today, certainly do feel free to reach out to the 1-800 number or to the email address. All information is kept confidential, and anyone can call with questions they may have about the ADA. We are here for you and all of our constituents in our region. So, you know, we have an hour, and there's certainly a lot to talk about and to cover when it comes to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we'll start with a few ADA basics. I'll move on to some of the key concepts, kind of the foundational concepts of the ADA, particularly when it comes to Title I, which is employment, which is what we're focusing on today. And we'll talk about disability disclosure and what that means, particularly when it comes to the world of work in the workplace. We'll talk about the foundational concept of reasonable accommodation in the workplace. Something called the interactive process we'll talk about, and then I'll present you also with some resources. And I do want you to know also, if you have questions, comments, suggestions, anything, feel free to type them in the chat box. I believe maybe you can use the chat or the Q&A feature. I don't want to speak for Aaron, but feel free to type in any comments or questions. I'm happy to take them as we move forward. And so I mentioned that I wanted to give a little background, kind of just some basics about the ADA and what the ADA is. I know many of you, maybe all of you here, may know what the ADA is, but just to set some context for all of us when it comes to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the ADA has 5 titles, and I mentioned that today we are going to focus on Title I, which are the employment provisions, which prohibits disability discrimination in all employment processes. But just really quickly, Title II prohibits discrimination in state and local government or public services, right? And so the ADA addresses services and activities of states and local governments, things like, including public transportation. So that's Title II. Title III talks about physical and program accessibility in places of private business. So think about restaurants, hotels, stores, any place that you do business, right? Could be hotels, motels, could be movie theaters, grocery stores, privately owned transportation. Title IV of the ADA requires the provision of telecommunication relay services to enable people with hearing who are deaf or hard of hearing, or people with speech disabilities to use the nation's telecommunication systems. And Title V is kind of a catch-all, and Title V addresses the relationship between the ADA, Section 504 of the Rehab Act, and state laws. It also offers protection from retaliation. So but we're going to be focusing on Title I today, which are the employment provisions of the ADA. And I like to kind of remind all of us too about, I often will use this language of the spirit of the ADA. And there's a photo here of the President Bush, the first President Bush in 1990, July 26, 1990, signing the ADA into law. And it's just a reminder that the ADA was really a bipartisan law. It had support from the Democrats and the Republicans. They had support, lots of support. And at the time of the signing of the ADA, one of the founders, Justin Dart, stated, as it says here, the ADA is the Civil Rights Act of the future. And President Bush at the time called it the world's first comprehensive declaration of equality for people with disabilities. So it's just that reminder that the ADA is about civil rights for people with disabilities. It was based upon the civil rights laws of the 1960s. And so, although the ADA certainly is a law, right? Laws are important. It's the spirit of the ADA is that it's about civil rights and equal opportunity and equal access for people with disabilities in our country. And I'm the employment guy. I mentioned there's 5 titles of the ADA that cover all aspects of life, and they're all important, right? I tend to have sort of a passion and belief and knowledge and expertise on Title I of the ADA and employment. And one little piece of the ADA that I pull out here when it comes to employment, when it comes to work and jobs, is this idea of being a qualified. The ADA will talk about, in general, you have to be a qualified individual with a disability. And so what I mean when I say qualified is that for employment, in order to be qualified, it means that you have to have the skills and ability and experience that the employer requires to perform the job, right? There's certainly some jobs, disability or no disability, that I am not able to perform because I don't have the skills and ability. I will probably not make a very good accountant, right? My brother's an accountant. I don't have probably the knowledge, the ability, the wherewithal to be an accountant, right? So one is that access to the ADA when it comes to getting a job is based on merit. I mean that we have to meet the requirements, the qualifications for the job that the employer expects to get done. Now, the other thing I like to share related to that, and this is one of those statements that comes up all the time that you may hear if you're applying for jobs, is that we also, if one has a disability, have to, and actually even if you don't have a disability, you have to be able, and this is the question that I have circled here, the statement, be able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation. That is the question employers can ask any job applicant, so that if I have a disability and I need an application, I'm able to say, yes, I'm able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation, right? The whole idea is that employers can't be asking about disability before they hire us. It's actually illegal to do so, but they can ask if we can perform the essential functions with or without a reasonable accommodation. So if I need an accommodation, I could say, yes, I am able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation. I don't have to disclose at that point in time. So I use this language and this symbol a lot in training, not just ADA training. And I talk about the heart of the matter. And so you see here this image of an artichoke. And that's just to remind us, I don't know if you've ever eaten an artichoke or peeled back the leaves of the artichoke, which by the way are a little prickly, but when you peel back the leaves of the artichoke, you get to the center, right? And what's at the center of an artichoke? It's the heart, right? And so the heart of the matter when it comes to the ADA is that the ADA is about non-discrimination, right? Adam, it looks like you have your hand raised. If you do, and you intended to do that, you would just have to unmute your microphone. Hi, Adam.
Hi.
Do you have a question?
What is
Did you have a question?
ADA?
What's that, buddy? Go ahead again. I'm sorry. What is the ADA?
Yes.
Well, the ADA, that's what I'm talking about here right now. The ADA is a law that was passed to prevent discrimination against people with disabilities. So that's what we're going to be talking about as we go through our session today. Nice hearing from you. It's nice to hear a voice. So the first thing I'm going to mention here, as I mentioned in our intro slide, is a little bit about disability disclosure in the workplace. In other words, you know, when and how does a person have to share with their employer that they have a disability? And I'm going to start with a video clip that I want you to watch about disability disclosure in the workplace. And this video clip is captioned as well. So give me 1 second. Once I start clicking, when I start the video, I'm going to stop my video for a second. And there we go. I'm going to mute. I'm not going to mute myself.
He's a handsome boy.
Keep going that way.
My first question when they told me that I had Asperger's was, is there a cure? And so knowing that it was something that I was going to have to deal with my whole life was kind of heartbreaking. I had been blaming myself, you know, and I hated myself really for not being able to make friends and things like that. And so having the diagnosis gave me the ability to say it's not my fault, it's the Asperger's. The job that I had previous from here, I ended up having a hard time between me and my coworkers because they didn't understand me and I didn't understand them. And so there was a miscommunication between all of us. And so when I came here, I had been diagnosed for only a couple of months or so, and I had learned what disclosure meant. And so this was my first opportunity really to disclose, and I had talked about it with my parents as to whether I should or whether I shouldn't. That's a big decision to make because, you know, to just put yourself out there to somebody that you don't even know, it's hard to do. But I found that once I disclosed, it made the difference because it closed that lack of miscommunication. One of the first things I did in the interview was I disclosed and told Sean, the manager, that I had Asperger's syndrome. And I explained it a little bit, and he had a little bit of an understanding of what it may be. And I truly believe that that changed everything. This is Dr. Arneson. He's the boss.
When she came along, you know, we interviewed her just as anybody else who'd come down the pike, and, you know, we were made aware that she had an issue, and, you know, but, you know, tried not to let that influence whether we said yes or no about hiring her. And since we've hired her, yeah, we've been absolutely nothing but pleased and would hire her again in a heartbeat. The only challenge, you know, was the challenge that she may have had. You know, I don't think we had any challenges, and her work was always good from the get-go. But now that she's actually a department head of the assistants now, And since she's been given that responsibility, I've just seen her blossom. I mean, she's taken that responsibility and run with it and done just a spectacular job.
When I first started working here, I was having a hard time remembering what the instruments were called and how they were supposed to be packaged. So I ended up actually talking to one of our technicians about having that issue of having to remember all that. And she gave me a book of all the instruments, surgical instruments that there like ever was. And so I went through the book, which was really thick. Then I sat down at home and I drew out the instruments and wrote beside it what it was called. Kind of everybody uses them, and we use them when we're training new assistants or interns or anybody that comes in. We'll use them. So they've not only benefited me, but they've benefited everybody else too. And here is where we keep the animals that are staying with us for the day. I think that these guys got surgery today because they look pretty woozy. You got sad eyes, puppy. In our first staff meeting that I was a part of here, I ended up disclosing to the whole staff. And I had been working with them for I think like 2 or 3 weeks, and then we had the staff meeting. So they had gotten to know me a little bit. After I disclosed to them, after that meeting, all of them were coming up to me and asking me questions, not just about Asperger's, but they had also asked me questions like, oh, is that why you don't really look me in the eye very much? I thought you didn't like me. And I'm like, no, that's why. My advice for anybody with any kind of disability, especially a hidden disability, is to disclose, because that just closes that wall of miscommunication that's going to end up being a big barrier for you.
So let's see, let me start my video again. So there's a lot that was covered in that video. What I really like about that video is a few different things. One is that it's that reminder that not all disabilities are what you see, right, or obvious. Some disabilities, sometimes we say they're hidden or they're invisible, right? And in her case, you don't necessarily know she has ability just by looking at her, right, or meeting her. But in her case, she was comfortable. She chose to disclose or share with the boss, right, the people that hired her for the job, that she had a disability. In her case, she described it as that Asperger's syndrome, or being on the autism spectrum, and that there might be certain things that would be difficult for her. But what that did was that allowed her, once she shared that she had a disability, to receive, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, an accommodation in the workplace, which is a different way of doing things. She in her example, remember, she had all those different instruments that she needed to learn for her job. So she actually had on the wall pictures of them with the description, which, by the way, something like that's an accommodation, not only helped her, it helped other people in their training. I don't know about you, but I would definitely need something like that to help me learn what all those instruments are for, right? So sometimes an accommodation that we put in place for one person can help lots of people on the job. So I work at Cornell, and right, I have coworkers, colleagues that do research, right? And one of the surveys that they sent out asked people, what is a very important factor for you when you decide to disclose a disability or share that you have a disability to an employer? And you'll see here right near the top, the number one reason people share that they have a disability, disclose a disability to an employer, is that you need an accommodation, right? You need, and I'm going to talk about accommodations in a few minutes, but it's a different way of doing the job, right? In the video, her accommodation might have been that she didn't need a lot of accommodations, but that she had those pictures on the wall of, from the book of what the instruments were and the label for those instruments, right, of what they were called. That might have been her accommodation. For someone else, It might be a changed work schedule. For another person, it might be, for someone who uses a wheelchair, it might be, lowering your desk, right? There's all sorts of accommodations. It could be technology for somebody to help them do their job. And when asking the same question, but a little differently, what's a very important factor when you choose not to disclose a disability? And you'll see right at the top that people worry about not being hired or being fired, or that the employer may treat you differently, right? So there's a lot of really good reasons that we have, and it's a very important process to go through, right? To think about, if I'm going to share with a business, with an employer, that I have a disability, right? What might be my reason for disclosing my disability, right? And really looking at the pros and cons of that. There's no one, it's a very personal choice that we all have to make, right? I've mentioned that it's just like the woman in the video, disability isn't about what you see, right? I think sometimes we think of disability as, what we see, right? And people in our world or businesses think about disability as one uses a wheelchair, right? Or maybe someone who uses a cane because they're blind or have a visual impairment, right? I think sometimes, or someone is deaf and uses sign language. That's something we may see right away, right? But there's many disabilities that you don't see. They're real, they're permanent, and you're covered under the ADA. So I have a few examples here on this slide. Things like depression or anxiety are very real disabilities that often were protected by the ADA. Maybe a learning disability. It's not necessarily something you see, but again, it's a non-obvious or an invisible disability that if we're working in a job, we may want to disclose to our employer if there's something we need done differently. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Cancer is a covered disability under the ADA. And disclosing that one has cancer or needs treatment for cancer, can also offer us the protections of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Multiple sclerosis, we've used the example of autism. Someone who has epilepsy, who has seizures, is also protected usually by the ADA. So it's not just about what we see. So let's say that I have a disability and I want to disclose that disability to my employer, right? The first thing I always tell people is that when I'm disclosing a disability, it says here that people can use plain language, right? There's no magic words necessarily. So I could say something as simple as, to my employer, because of X medical condition or a situation that I have, I'm having trouble performing one of my job duties, right? That's a disclosure situation. I don't have to necessarily mention the word disability. I don't have to mention the word Americans with Disabilities Act. I don't have to even necessarily mention the word that I'm looking for an accommodation, right? But the employer, once I disclose that I have a disability, usually, but not always, it's because I might want an accommodation. The business, the employer, whoever maybe it's during the application process. So it might be the hiring manager. Maybe it's once I'm hired and it might be my supervisor on the job. The employer has to respond in a timely manner, right? Meaning there's no exact time frame, but if I disclose that I have a disability and then request an accommodation, something to be done a little differently on my job, the employer has to respond in a timely manner. So there's no time frame. It doesn't mean it has to be 1 day, 1 week, but waiting 3 months is not timely, right? Once I disclose my disability to the employer, what starts is what's called the interactive process, as you see here. And that means that I make a disclosure that I have a disability. The employer, and maybe I'm requesting an accommodation, or maybe the employer's, in this instance, the interactive process means the employer should be asking me questions or talking about it with me. Maybe I request an accommodation. Hey, I have a disability and, I'm going to need, maybe it's a medical disability and I need to get treatment, once a week, right? Let's talk about that and what that might mean and what that might look like. That's the interactive process, right? Maybe I'm requesting that there's a task that doesn't happen all the time. Let's say I'm applying for a clerical job, an office job. And, my job is to, do filing and answer the phones, and I can do all that okay. But I have difficulty using my hands. And part of that job is doing mailings a couple times a year, right? I might say, that would be a task that would be difficult for me. Could I focus on something else, and do more of the other duties during those times and not do those duties, right? That's all a part of that interactive process. It's having conversation. It has to make business sense to the employer because their job is to make sure the job gets done. But that's a part of that interactive process. So when it says here, the employer can have a formal process that employees must follow, right? So some employers might have us go to HR. Some employers might, have us complete documentation as a part of that process or put it in writing, right? Some employers, especially for disabilities that aren't obvious, might ask for, as it says here, medical documentation, right? It's employers totally within their right to ask for, from whether it's from a doctor, or whether it's from a psychologist, whatever our disability is, from a medical or some sort of professional, ask for documentation, right? It has to be, as it says here, job related and consistent with business necessity. What I mean is they don't get our whole medical file, right? They don't get to ask me for my whole medical file and every single thing from my medical file, including my pediatric records, right? It has to be related to the job. So if I'm requesting a sit-stand desk, one of those desks where people stand up sometimes and can sit down, those desks I'm talking about, they could ask for documentation from my doctor, my medical provider, of why. Maybe it's related to a back issue I have. Maybe it's related to, some other physical situation. Maybe it's arthritis, who knows? Whatever, they're certainly entitled to request the medical documentation, but it has to be related to the accommodation that I'm asking for. So I have a scenario here. Oh, and I believe Aaron's going to bring this up as I'm going to read the scenario to you. It's also on the screen. And Aaron's going to bring up an ABCD list of choices in a minute. But let me read the scenario to you. And I'm going to ask you to think about this and then respond with one or more of the choices we'll present to you. This is about Wanda, right? Wanda was hired as a warehouse assistant in a distribution center for a large pharmaceutical retailer. After working for 1 week, Wanda told her supervisor that she has diabetes and would need an accommodation of 1 extra 10-minute break during the day to monitor her condition. Her supervisor now wants to fire Wanda because the supervisor believes Wanda lied during the interview by not disclosing her accommodation need. So we have 4 choices here. And keep in mind, more than one of these can be correct. What do you think the right answer is to this situation of Wanda requesting a 10-minute break because she has diabetes and needs to monitor her condition during this 10-minute break, right? She didn't disclose the disability when she was hired for the job, but she's now disclosing it now that she has diabetes. So what do you think should happen? A, transfer Wanda to another job within the firm. B, terminate Wanda because she failed to inform the employer of an accommodation need when she was hired. C, begin the interactive process to put a reasonable accommodation in place. And or D, educate supervisors about accommodation rights and responsibilities. Oh, and so I'm sorry, I said I was going to launch the poll. There we go. So you should see the 4 choices there on the screen. What do you think? Does anyone want to take a shot at selecting one of the 4? I think you can only select one. What do you think? I'll give you a minute to do that before I end the poll. And we don't see who's responding what, so you're totally anonymous here, by the way. Any thoughts? We got a couple of you responding. Anyone else? Give you another second to do that. Can't wait too long because we want to keep things moving. So I'm going to end the poll. Oh, there we go. I just ended. I'm going to share the results. Okay. So it looks like we're split. About a third of us said transfer Wanda to another job. Another third of us said begin the interactive process to put an accommodation in place. And another third of us, or 33%, said educate supervisors about accommodations, rights, and responsibilities. So we're kind of split here, and that often happens. And let's see if I have the results up here. Hold on. There, it's taken a minute for them to show up. There we go. So the correct answer is C. Answers, there's two that are correct. Begin the interactive process to put a reasonable accommodation in place and educate supervisors about accommodation rights and responsibilities. A, transfer Wanda to another job, although that certainly could happen if Wanda wanted that. There's not enough information now to make that decision. Wanda is certainly, we know, capable of doing her job, and terminating her or transferring her aren't the right answer because she's capable of doing her job. It doesn't seem that asking for a 10-minute break is unreasonable. We get breaks within our workday, right? And it says here, you know, terminate her because she didn't tell her employer about accommodation need when she was hired. It's a reminder that Wanda and anyone can disclose an accommodation at any point. Maybe when she was hired, she thought she could do the job without an accommodation, right? And then once she got hired, she realized, oh, I'm going to need to take an extra 10-minute break or what have you to monitor my diabetes. Maybe she acquired the diabetes while she was working there. Sometimes we acquire a disability that we maybe didn't have at the time of hire, right? So thanks for having fun with that scenario there. But the key takeaway here is that it's important to educate businesses at all times about, you know, supervisors and businesses about the ADA and about accommodation rights and responsibilities. And we can disclose our disability to an employer at any time during the process. Another scenario I'll go through here really quickly, a true false. An employee who first discloses disability, an employee who first discloses a disability in response to a termination action cannot be fired because this would constitute discrimination under the ADA, right? So let's say that I have it, like, you know, let's think of the woman in the video who it's not necessarily obvious she had a disability. And let's say that I've broken some rule or done something at my job that anybody could perhaps be written up for by their human resources or even fired for. Right. And let's say I haven't told anyone I have a disability and then I'm about to be fired, or I'm in with my human resources and about to be written up or fired. And I say, oh, wait a minute, I didn't tell you I actually have a disability. I happen to be on the autism spectrum, or I happen to have a learning disability. Right. Or I happen to be hard of hearing. I didn't know if you knew that. Right. So could an employer in that example still fire me? Or would that be discrimination under the ADA? And I don't know if anyone wants to take a shot at that, but what you think. But I'll tell you what the answer is here. The answer is actually, hold on, I'm clicking a couple. There we go. The answer is false, right? If I have not disclosed my disability to an employer, right, I am not entitled to the protections of the ADA. I'm not entitled to an accommodation under the ADA because the responsibility of me as an employee or a job seeker, if I'm looking for a job, is to disclose my disability to my employer, especially if I want an accommodation, you know, something done a little differently on the job. I have to make them aware. If they don't know I have a disability, there's no protections I get under the ADA. So if we know we need an accommodation at work, disclosing our disability is often very important. I want to get to our section here on reasonable accommodation in the workplace. So I mentioned that this is one of those really important or foundational concepts when it comes to knowing your rights and the ADA. And we've talked about accommodation a little bit. But first of all, I want to share, what is a reasonable accommodation, right? When you hear this term, accommodation, right? And we may hear about accommodations a lot when it comes to employment, right? An accommodation is actually any change in the work environment or in the way things are customarily done that enables an individual with a disability to enjoy equal employment opportunities and the opportunity to attain the same level of performance or to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment. So I know that's a lot, right? But accommodation is basically looking at doing a job a little differently. Maybe it's doing a job task a little differently, right? And the last line here, the opportunity to attain the same level of performance and enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment, right? The whole idea of accommodations is it's to perform our job duties, right? We might need something done a little differently to perform our job duties, but it's also to enjoy the benefits of employment. There are things that happen at work that are sort of what I call the non-work benefits of work, and I'll go over a couple examples of those in a minute, that employers are obligated to accommodate. But let's look at it this way. I'll kind of back this up a little bit. So think of it as I'm going to share in a moment, 3 different categories or kind of groups or buckets of accommodations. When we think about accommodations and employment, and one is accommodations during the job application process. So if I'm out looking for work, I'm a job seeker, I'm looking for employment, right? Employers are required under the ADA to make sure that the job application process is accessible. So I don't know if you can think of any accommodations that an employer might make when you're looking for a job or applying for a job, but think about this when it comes to accommodations during the job application process. It might be conducting the job interview in a physically accessible location. So if I'm using a wheelchair, or I have difficulty walking, right? And there's a flight of stairs in the building to get to the room where the job interview is happening, or to the job fair. If, there's a flight of stairs and I'm using a wheelchair, it would be important to make sure that the interview is in a location that I can access using my wheelchair. But it's beyond physical accessibility. Maybe it's if I'm deaf or hard of hearing, providing a sign language interpreter for the job interview. Employers are required in most occasions, in most instances, to provide these accommodations like a sign language interpreter. It might be modifying tests during the application process. Maybe it's the training materials. Maybe I need a little more time. Sometimes there's these online applications. Maybe I need a little more time to complete that application online, right? Maybe I need the material, I'm blind and need the material in Braille. Maybe I have vision loss and need the material in large print, right? Maybe I don't do really well with written tests and might want a more extensive job interview in person or through a Zoom meeting, right? Those could all be accommodations that could be reasonable during the application process, but we have to request them, right? And we'd have to let an employer know we need an accommodation, but employers are required to modify their application process. Oh, and another accommodation, I don't know if anyone here has worked with a job coach or knows of someone who's worked with a job coach. Allowing a job coach into a job interview is, in most instances, considered a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. Performing the essential functions of the job. So that basically means that once I'm hired to work a job, if I need an accommodation, if I need, like I've mentioned earlier, maybe it's if I'm blind, a screen reader that will read the screen to me is an accommodation for someone who's blind, right? That helps me perform my job duties. Maybe it's, as I mentioned earlier, if I use a wheelchair and my desk needs to be lowered, that could be an accommodation, right? Maybe I, have difficulty reading and need pictures, or just simple descriptions, kind of like in the video where she had descriptions over the different tools. That's an accommodation that I could request, right? Anything that will help me perform the job. Maybe I get, I go to a counselor every week, due to my disability, and it's really important that I make those appointments. Or maybe, I attend meetings related to my recovery from, substance abuse or, alcohol or whatever, which is also covered under the ADA. that could be an accommodation, a modified schedule. Maybe I take medication that makes it hard for me to, in the mornings. If it's reasonable to the employer and it makes sense, business sense for the employer to offer an accommodation of a changed schedule, that could be another accommodation, right? There's any number of accommodations that might be offered, and it's all about that discussion that we have with the employer, that interactive process that I talked about before. And last but not least, and what's often overlooked, is another category of accommodations is to allow employees to enjoyment of the equal benefits and privileges of employment. Now, you might be like, Jeffrey, what do you mean equal benefits and privileges of employment? What are you talking about? I mentioned briefly a moment ago, we all have, for those of us who've had jobs, we know there are non-work benefits of work. We think of work of, I go to work and I do my job duties and I go home, right? And certainly that's the reason we're there, is to get the job done, to help the employer, to meet the bottom line of business, to get a paycheck, to feel good about ourselves out in the community, whatever. But there's other benefits of work. It's meeting with colleagues. Maybe my business has a softball team that people can join. Maybe there's parties that happen, or get-togethers or gatherings for work that are off-site, right? So things like making sure office parties, break rooms, employee spaces are in a location where everyone can access them. So if I use a wheelchair, for example, but the break room's in a place that's up a flight of stairs, right? Or maybe even team meetings take place, or office get-togethers take place, in a restaurant offsite where that's not physically accessible to me. That isn't enjoying the equal benefits and privileges of employment. So we want to make sure that the application process is accessible. We are able to request accommodations if we need to get the job done, the essential functions of the job, and just anything else that other employees are taking advantage of at work. Maybe there's a benefits fair at your work where everyone's learning about the new healthcare benefits are coming out. Is that in a location that everyone can get to, that everyone can access, right? Those are important things to think about when it comes to work. But we have to disclose our disability and make sure the employer is aware that we need that accommodation. So, few things when I talk about reasonable accommodation. Accommodations have to be provided to applicants and employees, so job applicants and employees with known disabilities. So as I've said, if I have a disability, particularly a disability that's not obvious, that you don't see, that's invisible, whatever language you want to use, I have an obligation as an employee with a disability or someone looking for a job with a disability to let my employer know, to disclose. But if an employer doesn't know that I have a disability, they're under no obligation to accommodate that disability under the ADA. So disclosure is an important step in this process, and it's a personal choice that we all have to make if we have a disability, particularly a not obvious disability. Do I want to disclose to my employer, to a business? What's the impact of that going to be? Will employer treat me differently? How do I explain it? What is it I'm looking for? What do I want an employer to know about my disability, right? Those are all questions that we need to think about when it comes to disclosure. I mentioned the interactive process more than once, right? Once I disclose, it's meant to start what's called this interactive process, where if I disclose a disability to an employer and request an accommodation, so I might say, I have this disability, and the medication I take because of my disability makes it really difficult to, be here really early mornings, but I'm more than willing to work a little bit later shift and work a little bit later. And, I'll be here and I'll be productive and I'll be a good employee and all those things. That's the interactive process. The employer then has to come back to us with, is that reasonable? Does that work for them? Does it not? It's meant to be a give and take and a discussion as well. That's that interactive process that we engage in with employers. I've mentioned medical documentation already. That employer may, especially if I have a disability that's not obvious, that you can't see, can request something from my doctor, right? And we are under an obligation to bring that in, right? As long as it's job related and consistent with business necessity. And the other thing that comes up under the ADA that I haven't mentioned yet is that employers are required to provide reasonable accommodation unless there is, and this is the last bullet here, an undue hardship, or sometimes they talk about direct threat. So unless it provides causes an undue hardship to the employer, right? And let me explain what that means. So undue hardship can mean that either financially, the accommodation I'm requesting would be difficult for the business because it's just too expensive, which is often what people think about when they think about undue hardship, or a disruption in the work process. So let's talk, just for a second, I'll talk about financial hardship. You know, a lot of times employers think, which is actually a myth, that accommodations are very expensive and it's going to cost a lot of money for this accommodation. The reality is that most accommodations are low cost or no cost. The vast majority of accommodations are under $500, right? And many accommodations are free, right? Are no cost whatsoever, right? The cost, you know, let's say that I'm a person of short stature, which can be a disability under the ADA, and I need a stool to reach the upper file cabinet, right? So employers required to provide a stool. What's a stool cost? You know, $10, right? You know, but that undue hardship, especially undue financial hardship, employers really have to look at. Not, you know, let's say that I'm a large business. Let's say I'm Target, right? So if I'm Target, and an employee requests a reasonable accommodation, you know, say I request something, you know, maybe it's some specialized equipment that I need to do my job, you know, maybe it's a screen reader, whatever. Target is required to most likely provide that accommodation and can't say it's too expensive because Target's a multi-million-dollar company. They're not just going to look at one budget for one department. Oh, I'm in houseware, so I'm only going to look at that department. If anyone ever came in and had to investigate a claim of discrimination, they're going to look at the entire budget of the company, right? And that could be any company, right? You know, that one works for. I work for Cornell University. Right? If I request an accommodation, I'm denying an accommodation because they say it's too expensive. In many instances, what's going to happen is they're not just going to look at the budget for my one department that I work at the Yang Institute. They're going to look at all of Cornell. Cornell's a huge place with thousands of employees, right? With a multi-million-dollar budget. So undue hardship can be hard to prove, you know, and in most cases, employers are kind of not well informed about undue hardship. So direct threat basically means if an employer thinks that my working at a job that the accommodation and my disability might either, you know, my doing that job might harm myself or others, that's direct threat. So for example, if I'm a bus driver and one day I go to work and I start slurring my words or kind of swaying back and forth, and that's different. Maybe, you know, I'm stumbling, you know, and that's not normally how I walk. An employer can say, you know, hold on a minute, we need to send you for a total medical workup, right? Because of direct threat. Because as a bus driver, whether it's because I had a stroke, it's not for an employer to discern that. They're not a doctor, right? But whether it's I had a stroke, whether it's they think I've been drinking, the point is the employer doesn't say that. All the employer does is pull me from my job and have me make sure I get medical clearance. Because direct threat means if I get behind the wheel of that bus, you know, the way based on what the employer objectively witnesses, that I'm slurring my words, that I'm stumbling, slurring my speech, I could harm myself, I could harm other people, right? So that's an example of direct threat. But in most instances, employers are required to make accommodations as long as it's reasonable. And that interactive process kicks in where we talk about that. The employer's job is to get the work done. So employer has every right to expect that we're productive on the job, that we get the job done. So there's some basic roles and responsibilities that we all have. Employees, as employees with disabilities, we have responsibilities, and employers. So an employee has to request the accommodation, you know, disclose the disability and request, and the employer can verify the need. That would be by getting medical documentation if they desire it. Employee has to bring documentation from that medical provider if the employer requests it. The employer has to keep that confidential. That is not meant for the whole business to know about. The only one that should know about that and the accommodation is typically HR, maybe the supervisor or hiring manager, someone who's overseeing your work. And whether I'm an employee or an employer, it's important to participate in the process. Let's try another scenario. I'm going to pull up, well, I'll pull up the poll in a second, but this is about Eric, and this is a reasonable accommodation scenario. Eric, who has a mild intellectual disability, works in the produce department of a large grocery store chain. When Eric started the job 2 years ago, a job coach designed a system to ensure that Eric stocked the produce correctly. Since then, Eric has been performing well. 2 weeks ago, a new store manager came on board. This new manager has now told Eric that she is standardizing job processes and policies and that Eric's accommodation can't be used in the new system. The managers told Eric that he must learn the new system or find another job. So I'm going to bring up a polling question. Oh, how do I get to the new polling question? Oh, I just figured it out. Never mind. Thank you. There you go. I'm launching the polling questions, but I'll read them to you as well. So hold on here. There we go. So which of these is correct? And again, more than one can be correct. Remember, Eric's had these accommodations in place at his job and been successful at his job for a couple years. New manager says, we're taking away your accommodations. You have to learn the new way of doing things or get another job. So what would you do? What do you think should happen in this instance? Refer Eric to an agency that will enable him to find another job. Involve Eric's job coach to find an accommodation alternative that might work with the new store manager's system. The new store manager could be required to modify policies and processes as an accommodation. And or D, the business needs to make sure that all store managers fully understand their ADA obligations. So what do you think? I know some of you have started to reply. Does anyone else have any thoughts? I'll give you a minute to think about it. So it looks like I'm going to end the poll and share the results in the interest of time. Looks like most of us, about 3/4 of us, not quite, said involve Eric's job coach to find accommodation alternatives that might work with the new store manager's system. And another said the new store manager could be required to modify policies, processes as an accommodation, right? And both are correct. So the correct answer is, and if you want to get rid of that poll, you just have to exit off your screen or minimize it, by the way. Correct answers are involve Eric's job coach, as someone said, very good, to find an accommodation alternative. So just because this accommodation doesn't work anymore, maybe there's another accommodation that will work. That's that interactive process I talked about, that discussion, that give and take. The new store manager could be required to modify policies and processes, right? Just because the business has a policy doesn't mean a policy could discriminate against a person with a disability. If I say that we have a policy that a job coach isn't allowed at the job site, well, guess what? That discriminates against a whole category of people with disabilities that would benefit from that. And so they might have to modify their policy or their process. Just because it says it in the manual doesn't always mean it's so. And the business needs to make sure that all managers understand the ADA. It's about educating businesses and make sure they're clear and they're aware about their ADA obligation. So if an employee, we kind of covered this in Wanda's scenario. Do I have this? I think we have this as a true false. Yeah, now it's up on the screen. If an employee did not discuss or disclose a disability at the time of hire, they cannot request a reasonable accommodation once employed. What do you think? True or false? It should pop up on your screen. And we have gone over this one, but I like to drive the point home about disclosure. And I know we're only up to a couple minutes left here. So anyone else want to check true or false here? Well, there we go. I'm going to end the poll only because we only have a couple minutes left. Sorry to be so quick. We're split down the middle here. And I want to remind all of us. So some said true, some said false. It's a little bit of a tricky question. The answer is false. Remember, if an employee did not disclose a disability when they were hired, you still can request a reasonable accommodation once employed. It is not a lie if you haven't disclosed your disability at the time of hire. Disclosure is a legally protected right. It's a personal choice. What's right for one person may not be right for the other person. The woman in the video that had Asperger's, as she defined it, chose to disclose. That was her choice, and it helped in her situation. She wanted the employer to know, but someone else may not want to make that decision, or maybe thinks they can do the job without an accommodation, or wants to try it out, or is worried about someone treating them differently, right? There's no one answer to this question, but disclosure is a legally protected right, and we can disclose at any point in time. You know, we can disclose on the first day, before the job starts, on the first day, the first month, the first year, or 5 years down the line, right? It really is an important conversation to have with other people in your life, whoever that might be. If you have a disability, you know, to sort of weigh the pros and the cons of disclosure. What are the benefits of disclosure, and what might be a problem if I disclose? I think it's fair that we all may answer that question a little bit differently. But typically, if you need an accommodation, it is important to disclose. So I'm just going to, before we leave today, go over a few examples of what is typically considered a reasonable accommodation. So the things that are listed here: modifications to increase facility accessibility, you know, making sure a building is accessible to someone with a physical disability, for example, is usually a reasonable accommodation. Restructuring a job, maybe it's changing a job around, maybe it's changing, you know, the schedule a little bit, is often considered a reasonable accommodation, right? Maybe when I do something, or the hours I do something, not every time, but often. Acquiring new equipment, I've talked about that quite a bit today, is a reasonable accommodation most of the time. Someone who needs a sign language interpreter, or someone who is blind who needs a qualified reader, often is considered a reasonable accommodation under the ADA, most of the time, in fact. I've talked about modifying the application and testing procedures, or maybe training materials for someone. And I've talked about allowing a job coach at the work site. Those are most of the time considered reasonable under the ADA. And the ones here, I'll just put them all up here, that are usually not reasonable: eliminating essential job functions. We're hired to do a job. If the function is essential, the employer doesn't have to eliminate it. They have to consider accommodating it, but not eliminating the job function. Lowering production standards. Employers have every right to expect the same level of production, you know, and productivity of all employees, again, with an accommodation in place. Providing personal use items. Employers don't have to provide things like reading glasses or hearing aids or a cane if I use that to help me walk, or a wheelchair. You know, those are personal use items. Changing an employee's supervisor is not an accommodation under the ADA. Talking to the employer about how they respond to a person who has a disability might be, but not changing the supervisor. And again, excusing a violation of uniformly applied rules of conduct, right? My employer expects me to be on time every day. That's no different for me as compared to anyone else, right? If an employer expects that I act a certain way, behave a certain way, right? Wear a certain, you know, uniform, or dress a certain way, that can be the same for everybody, regardless of disability, and is not considered an accommodation. There is a lot more information. You have access to this PowerPoint in the chat here. You'll be getting a survey afterwards. We hope you will fill it out. Remember, if you have any questions after today, please don't hesitate to call us at 1-800-949-4232. We're always here to answer